The towns with no cemeteries. Where did the dead go before 1900? In 1891, workers excavating for a new courthouse in Frankfort, Kentucky, discovered human remains 3 feet below the construction site. The Kentucky Gazette reported on the 17th of March 1891 that at least 47 bodies were found, some with remnants of clothing dating to the early 1800s. City records showed no cemetery had ever existed at that location. The county clerk's office had no burial permits, no land deeds mentioning cemetery use, no maps indicating graves. The bodies were reburied at Frankfort Cemetery, and construction continued. No explanation was ever recorded for why dozens of people had been buried in what was supposed to be undeveloped land in the centre of town between 1870 and 1920. Similar discoveries occurred in at least 73 American towns. Construction workers, railroad crews, and farmers uncovered human remains in locations where no cemetery was supposed to exist. The pattern was consistent: bodies found in town centres, along main streets, beneath public buildings, in areas that local records showed had never been designated for burial. Some discoveries involved hundreds of individuals. Most involved no records explaining who they were or why they were buried there. The pattern emerges. On the 23rd of July, 1885, the Cincinnati Enquirer reported that workers grading land for railroad expansion near the city centre unearthed over 200 skeletons. The railroad company's surveyor, James Patterson, stated in his official report that the bodies were laid in neat rows, suggesting organised cemetery rather than random burial. But Hamilton County records contain no documentation of any cemetery at that location. The nearest recorded cemetery was Mount Auburn, established in 1845, over a mile away. In 1902, construction of Philadelphia's new City Hall annex uncovered human remains beneath what city records showed as vacant lot since the 1700s. The Philadelphia Enquirer published detailed account on the 12th of August 1902 describing at least 83 individuals found during excavation. City archivist Samuel Hazard examined historical maps and land deeds dating to 1682 and found no reference to cemetery use. The bodies were relocated to Mount Moriah Cemetery, but the Philadelphia Department of Records never updated its historical documentation to explain the burials between 1895 and 1908. Chicago experienced similar discoveries at 14 different construction sites. The Chicago Tribune documented each case. On the 3rd of September 1899, the paper reported that workers building the new Cook County Hospital found skeletal remains of at least 112 individuals. Hospital administrator Dr. Frank Billings told the Tribune that research into city records revealed no cemetery had existed at the location, though the body's positioning suggested intentional burial rather than mass grave from epidemic or disaster, the burial practices that preceded formal cemeteries. In 1638, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed law requiring that all burials occur in designated grounds blessed by church authority. The Plymouth Colony records, preserved at Pilgrim Hall Museum, document that enforcement was inconsistent. Selectmen's meeting minutes from Duxbury, dated the 15th of October, 1647, note that several families had buried relatives on their own property despite the law, and that penalties proved ineffective because families viewed home burial as right rather than violation. Pennsylvania followed different pattern. William Penn's 1682 Charter of Privileges did not require church-sanctioned burial grounds. The Pennsylvania archives contain land deeds from the 1680s and 1690s designating portions of family farms for burial use. The deed for the Shipley family property in Chester County, dated the 8th of June, 1687, specifically mentions quarter acre, reserved for family interment. By the mid-1700s, most American settlements had mixture of formal churchyard cemeteries and informal family burial grounds. The problem was documentation. Churches kept burial registers for their graveyards. Family burials on private land often went unrecorded, except in family Bibles or personal letters. When land changed ownership, knowledge of burials could disappear. The 1,794 sale of the Blackstone Farm in Rhode Island to new owners included no mention of family burial ground that had been in use since 1720. The Bristol County Registry of Deeds contains the sale document showing simple property transfer with no cemetery notation. In 1872, when that land was subdivided for residential development, workers discovered remains of at least 37 individuals. The Providence Journal reported on the 6th of May, 1872, that descendants of the original Blackstone family came forward claiming their ancestors had been buried there, but no written records existed to prove it. The Cemetery Reform Movement. On the 24th of September, 1831, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society dedicated Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. This was America's first rural cemetery, designed as landscaped park rather than utilitarian burial ground. The dedication ceremony, documented in the Society's 1832 annual report, was attended by Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who delivered address praising the cemetery as moral and aesthetic improvement over crowded urban churchyards. Mount Auburn's success inspired immediate imitation. Laurel Hill Cemetery opened in Philadelphia in 1836. Greenwood Cemetery opened in Brooklyn in 1838. Spring Grove Cemetery opened in Cincinnati in 1845. Each promoted the rural cemetery ideal: spacious, landscaped grounds outside city centers, permanent plots purchased by families, careful record-keeping, and prohibition of the informal burial practices that had previously prevailed. The rural cemetery movement gained momentum from public health concerns. In 1842, British reformer Edwin Chadwick published Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population. The report, which influenced American reformers, argued that urban churchyards were sources of disease. Chadwick claimed that decomposition of bodies in densely packed urban cemeteries contaminated groundwater and spread illness. American physicians embraced this argument. Dr. John H. Griscom published The Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population of New York in 1845. On pages 73 through 81, Griscom detailed conditions in New York City churchyards, describing overcrowding, shallow burials, and visible decomposition. He recommended that all city cemeteries be closed and that future burials occur only in rural cemeteries at least 2 miles from populated areas. Cities began acting on these recommendations. In 1847, New York State passed law prohibiting new burials in Manhattan below 86th Street. Boston passed similar ordinance in 1855, Philadelphia in 1859, Chicago in 1869. These laws forced closure of urban churchyards that had served communities for generations. The problem was what to do with existing burials. Some churches relocated their dead to new rural cemeteries. Trinity Church in Manhattan moved over 1,000 bodies from their church cemetery to Trinity Cemetery, uptown, between 1,842 and 1,852. The church kept detailed records, preserved in their archives, documenting each disinterment and reburial, but most churches lacked resources for such relocations. When St. Patrick's Cathedral closed its graveyard in 1858 following New York's prohibition, the Catholic diocese announced that families could pay to have their relatives relocated. The cost was $8 per body, equivalent to about $250 today. The New York Herald reported on the 3rd of April, 1858, that only 47 of approximately 300 families paid for relocation. The rest remained in closed cemetery beneath what is now Mulberry Street, the disappeared cemeteries. In 1866, Chicago's Common Council authorized development of the former city cemetery into Lincoln Park. The cemetery, established in 1835, contained approximately 35,000 burials. The Chicago Historical Society's archives contain council resolution from the 14th of May, 1866, stating that families would have 6 months to claim and relocate their dead. After that period, the city would remove remaining bodies. The Chicago Tribune published notices throughout 1,866 and 1,867, informing families of the deadline, but most bodies were never claimed. On the 20th of November 1867, the city contracted with workers to remove remaining burials. City Comptroller records show payment of $3,200 to undertaker Charles Fitch for removing approximately 12,000 bodies, but the cemetery had held 35,000 burials. What happened to the remaining 23,000? The Tribune published investigation on the 8th of March, 1869, revealing that many bodies had been left in place. Park landscaping simply covered the graves. Contractors had removed marked gravestone nests and formal monuments, but had not excavated all burials. Over the following decades, construction and maintenance in Lincoln Park repeatedly uncovered human remains. The Chicago Department of Parks recorded 17 separate incidents between 1,870 and 1,899 of workers finding bones during park improvements. Each time, the remains were collected and moved to Graceland Cemetery, but no comprehensive excavation ever occurred to remove all remaining burials. By 1900, Lincoln Park was established recreational space. Most Chicagoans had no idea they were picnicking and playing sports on former cemetery containing thousands of bodies that were never relocated, the African American burial grounds. On the 8th of October, 1991, construction workers preparing foundation for new federal office building in Manhattan uncovered human remains. The General Services Administration halted construction and called archaeologists. Over the following months, excavation revealed cemetery containing remains of at least 419 individuals, all of African descent, buried between approximately 1,690 and 1,794. The African burial ground, as it became known, was documented in city records from the colonial period. A 1,755 map in the New York Public Library clearly shows Negros burial ground north of the city limits. But by 1800, the cemetery had been built over and forgotten. For nearly 200 years, this cemetery's existence was known only to historians studying colonial documents. It did not appear on modern maps. Real estate developers and city planners were unaware of it. The 1,991 discovery sparked extensive research into similar cases. Historian Leslie M. Harris's 2003 book, In the Shadow of Slavery, documented at least 6 other African American cemeteries in Manhattan that were closed, built over, and disappeared from public knowledge between 1,800 and 1,870. The pattern was consistent. As Manhattan developed northward, African American cemeteries that had been outside city limits became valuable real estate. Unlike white cemeteries, which had churches or family associations advocating for their preservation, African American burial grounds often had no institutional protection. When land was sold for development, burials were rarely relocated. buildings simply went up over existing graves. Philadelphia had similar pattern. The first African Baptist church established cemetery for its congregation on South Street in 1810. Church records, preserved at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, document burials there until 1864. In 1865, the cemetery was sold to developer. Church minutes from the 12th of July, 1865, show the sale but contain no mention of relocating remains. Residential buildings were constructed on the site. In 1988, during renovations, workers discovered human bones beneath basement floors. Archaeological investigation identified at least 60 individuals who had been left in place when the cemetery was built over. The urban development pressure between 1,850 and 1,900 American cities experienced explosive growth. Manhattan's population increased from 516,000 in 1850 to 3.4 million by 1900. Chicago grew from 29,000 to 1.7 million. Philadelphia from 121,000 to 1.3 million. This growth created intense pressure on urban land. Property that had been cemeteries on city outskirts in 1850 became prime commercial real estate by 1880. The economic incentive to repurpose cemetery land was enormous. New York City's Common Council records from the 1860s and 1870s contain numerous petitions from developers seeking permission to build on former cemetery grounds. A typical petition, dated the 3rd of March 1871, from developer Samuel Ruggles, requested permission to develop land at 11th Street and 3rd Avenue that had been Potter's Field in the 1820s. Ruggles's petition argued that the cemetery had been closed for over 40 years, that most bodies had been relocated to Ward's Island, and that remaining land should be returned to productive use. The council approved most such petitions. Between 1865 and 1895, Manhattan issued at least 43 building permits for construction on former cemetery land. The permits, preserved in city archives, contain no requirements for archaeological survey or verification that all burials had been removed. Developers were required only to certify that no visible gravestones remained. The result was that thousands of bodies were built over. The 1886 construction of the Rhinelander building on the former cemetery at Washington Square discovered remains of at least 170 individuals. The New York Times reported on the 15th of November 1886 that the bodies were removed and reburied at Ward's Island. But the building's foundation contractor, Thomas Murphy, told the Times that his crew had encountered many more bones that we just covered with concrete to avoid construction delays. The records that disappeared. In 1723, the town of Wethersfield, Connecticut designated land on Main Street for public burial ground. The Wethersfield town meeting records, preserved at the Connecticut State Library, include resolution from March 4, 1723, establishing the cemetery and appointing John Bellamy as sexton responsible for maintaining burial records. Bellamy kept detailed ledger documenting each burial from 1723 until his death in 1751. The ledger, which survived in Wethersfield Historical Society archives, lists 347 individuals buried during that period, with dates, names, and plot locations. But after Bellamy's death, record keeping became inconsistent. The next sexton, appointed in 1752, kept no systematic records. Town meeting minutes from 1760 mentioned that cemetery records were in disarray and recommend improvement, but no action was documented. By 1790, the Wethersfield cemetery records were effectively lost. When the town surveyed its cemeteries in 1791, preparing report for the new federal census, surveyors could not determine how many people were buried in the Main Street Cemetery. Their report, dated the 20th of September 1791, estimates at least 600, possibly more. In 1867, when the town decided to close the Main Street Cemetery and relocate burials to new Riverview Cemetery, officials had no records identifying who was buried where. The Wethersfield Courant reported on the 8th of May, 1867, that the town hired workers to excavate the entire cemetery, relocate all remains found, and then level the land for commercial development. Workers spent 4 months excavating. According to town comptroller records, they relocated 589 identifiable individuals to Riverview. But they also found bones of at least 200 additional individuals whose burials had not been marked with stones or monuments. These remains were placed in common grave at Riverview with marker reading "Unknown Dead from Main Street Cemetery." The loss of cemetery records was a widespread problem. Fire destroyed many 18th and early 19th century church records. The 1,835 fire in New York City destroyed records of at least 15 churches. The 1,871 Chicago fire destroyed cemetery records for numerous churches and burial associations. The 1,906 San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed records for dozens of cemeteries. When records were lost, knowledge of burial locations disappeared with them. Descendants could not prove where ancestors were buried. When cemetery land was repurposed, there was no documentation to inform developers of burial locations. The question of deliberate erasure, the disappearance of African American, Native American, and immigrant cemeteries raises disturbing questions about whether some erasure was deliberate rather than accidental. In 1856, the city of Sacramento, California, ordered closure of the city cemetery where Chinese immigrants had been buried. The Sacramento Daily Union reported on the 14th of June, 1856, that Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association protested the closure and requested time to relocate burials. The city council granted 90 days. Chinese community leaders later claimed that 90 days was insufficient time to locate and relocate all burials, particularly since many graves were unmarked and cemetery records were kept in Chinese and were not accessible to city officials. The association's petition to the city council, dated the 10th of September, 1856, requested extension. The council voted 7-3 to deny the extension. Construction of commercial buildings began on the cemetery site in October 1856, before all burials could be relocated. How many remained in place is unknown, but Chinese community oral history, documented by historian Sylvia Sun Minnick in her 1988 book Samphao, The San Joaquin Chinese Legacy, suggests hundreds of burials were built over. Similar pattern occurred with Native American burial grounds. In 1880, the town of Wellfleet, Massachusetts, sold land that had been Wampanoag burial ground. The Wampanoag tribe had no legal standing to contest the sale under Massachusetts law at the time. The Cape Cod Times reported on the 22nd of March 1880 that Wampanoag representatives appeared at town meeting to protest, but their petition was not recognised. The land was sold to developer, and residential houses were constructed. In 1992, during housing renovations, workers uncovered remains of at least 18 individuals. DNA analysis confirmed Native American ancestry. The remains were repatriated to Wampanoag Nation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990. But tribal historians believe many more burials remain beneath existing buildings. The pattern suggests that marginalized communities' burial grounds were disproportionately vulnerable to erasure. White Protestant cemeteries maintained by established churches had institutional protection. Minority cemeteries often had no such protection and disappeared when land became valuable for development. What archaeology reveals, ground-penetrating radar and other archaeological technologies allow detection of buried remains without excavation. Since the 1990s, archaeologists have surveyed numerous urban locations where historical evidence suggests cemeteries might have existed. In 2003, archaeologists surveyed Washington Square Park in Manhattan using GPR. Their report, published by archaeological consultants of the Hudson Valley, identified anomalies consistent with at least 150 burial pits in areas where historical records indicated Potter's Field had existed in the 1790s and early 1800s. The survey confirmed that substantial numbers of burials remain beneath the park. Similar surveys in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco have repeatedly found evidence of burials in locations where no cemeteries appear on modern records. The archaeological evidence confirms the documentary pattern. Many urban areas contain forgotten cemeteries where thousands of people were buried and then built over when records disappeared or land was repurposed. The modern legal framework, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, signed into law on the 16th of November 1990, established federal requirements for handling Native American remains discovered on federal or tribal lands. The law requires consultation with tribes, opportunity for repatriation, and penalties for disturbing burial sites. Many states passed similar laws. In 2001, New York enacted Cemetery Act amendment requiring archaeological survey before construction on land with documented cemetery history. Massachusetts passed similar law in 2006, California in 2008. But these laws are limited. They apply only to known cemeteries or to remains actually discovered during construction. They do not require proactive identification of forgotten burial grounds before development. The legal burden remains on proving that cemetery existed, rather than on developers to prove it did not. The unanswered questions. How many forgotten cemeteries remain beneath American cities? The archaeological evidence suggests thousands. How many bodies were built over during urban development between 1850 and 1920? Conservative estimates based on documented cases suggest at least several hundred thousand. Why did record-keeping fail so completely for so many cemeteries? Partly through accident, fire, and administrative neglect. Partly through deliberate decisions not to maintain records for marginalized populations' burial grounds. The truth is probably a mixture of both, varying by location and circumstance. Should modern cities excavate forgotten cemeteries and relocate remains? The cost would be enormous. The disruption to existing buildings and infrastructure would be massive. The legal questions about who has authority to make such decisions are complex. For now, most forgotten cemeteries remain where they are, beneath streets and buildings, known to historians and archaeologists, but not to the people who live and work above them. The dead who went missing before 1900 are still missing. Their burial places remembered in fragments of historical records, but not marked on any modern map. The pattern is clear. Between approximately 1850 and 1920, thousands of people were buried in locations that were later built over, forgotten, or erased from official records. Some through honest loss of documentation. Some through economic pressure that made cemetery land too valuable to preserve. And some through deliberate marginalization of communities whose dead were not considered worth remembering. The result is that beneath many American cities lie thousands of bodies whose burial places disappeared from history, even though the bodies themselves remained in the ground where they were laid.